Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ellen Hannock. I'm director of the Water Policy Center at PPIC. Would first like to start by thanking everybody for making the trek here. This is our home office, and it's fun to be able to do a water event here in town. I want to maybe start with a few thank yous and just give you a quick rundown of the program, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the topic to kick us off. So what we're going to be talking about today is building drought resilience in the Bay Area. We've just come through a drought. We are, well, a water drought. We are now in a baseball drought, but that's probably a better, I don't know, maybe that's a better thing to be in. And so at PPIC, at the Water Policy Center, over the last few years, we've been using the experience of this drought to look at what lessons can we take away for getting better for managing droughts the next time they come around. And one of the very interesting aspects of this drought that we've just been through from that perspective, the 2012 to 2016 drought, was that it came with record temperatures. In addition to having a very extended dry period, we had the driest 4 years consecutively on record. We also had the hottest temperatures. And so that's the kind of drought that we're expecting to see more and more in the future as the climate is warming. And in a way, it gives managers around the state in different sectors a chance to kind of test out how well we're prepared for the changing conditions that we're looking at in California. Now, this particular study, we released a report in early June looking at statewide at challenges and opportunities that were experienced in the urban sector, and so I'm going to give you an overview of that, and then we've got a great lineup of speakers who are regional leaders who are going to be able to talk to you firsthand about what they've experienced, and then we're going to have a chance for audience Q&A during at the end of those panel discussions, and then we're going to have a chance to talk more informally afterwards over cookies and coffee. So if you don't get to ask your question here, you'll be able to hang out and ask your question later on. I want to thank a bunch of folks just to get going. First of all, this study was funded with, generously supported by a number of funders. It's part of a broader study that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is supporting, looking at drought lessons, and also by the generous support of the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, which has provided some seed funding for the Water Policy Center, and also Cal Water Service, which is one of the main utilities, private investor-owned utilities serving water in different parts of the state. And I also want to thank the event sponsors, which include Contra Costa Water District, and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, in addition to the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation. We've got some of the folks from these groups here among us. I'll just shout out Ken Jenkins from Cal Water, Allison Harvey Turner and Masika Henson from the Bechtel Foundation, Jerry Brown from the Contra Costa Water District, and I know, I don't have her name committed to my memory, but from Silicon Valley Foundation, we have... Thank you. Thank you. I need my glasses for that. So, okay. So I'm going to kick off now with a quick overview, and then I'm going to move into a mode of discussing with a special guest, the mayor of Livermore. So, there we go. It's my present. Here we go. Okay. So this is an effort by a team, including colleagues from here at PPIC, as well as David Mitchell from M-Cubed, as well as some colleagues from UC Riverside. And we did this work with a lot of input from folks at the local level and the state level, both in focus groups and discussions, but also we did a survey of urban water suppliers, and we were able to also use detailed data from the Cal Water system to help complement analysis of state level data. So you're going to see results that kind of reflect pulling together all that kind of information. So we're looking at, in this overall report, at what is urban drought resilience and how well did we do. Urban drought resilience, good way to start kind of thinking about that, is the ability to not to drought-proof yourself, that as though you never have any impacts, but to be able to weather droughts without significant economic and social disruptions. And there are really two components to drought resilience that you have to think of as a pair. One of them is having supply investments that reduce the risk of extreme shortages. And then the other is the ability to manage demand in the short term, because you never want to put so much investment into supply that you never have to reduce. That would probably not be cost effective. And the same on the demand side, if all you do is compress demand without having some robust supplies, that could lead to cutting so much that it starts to hurt in terms of the economy and society. So, key takeaways from this latest drought. Some big level conclusions. The urban water suppliers, there are about 410 of them around the state, large urban water agencies. They were generally well prepared, and the urban economy did well. We're actually growing at a faster pace than the national economy right now. There was an unusual aspect of this drought was a state policy with the governor's mandate to conserve water around the state, an average of 25%. And that mandate, people reacted to it very positively, and it showed that Californians can save water when they're asked to. But the mandate also was disruptive in some ways. It disrupted the local programs of drought resilience, and it created uncertainties about future state and local roles. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And so we conclude that the state and the locals really going forward for future droughts need to get on the same page and really align policies and expectations to be most effective at building drought resilience going forward. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of sort of lead up to the latest drought, what happened during the drought, and then our 5 kind of big takeaways. The first thing, and this is great because we had this presentation for a statewide audience, but the photo is from the Bay Area. This is a picture of an emergency pipeline on the San Rafael Bridge that was put in during the very severe and short drought in the late 70s because Marin was running out of water. So water was piped across the San Rafael Bridge. That was an emergency measure that was effective, but it's not the kind of thing that water managers want to have to do. So these kinds of supply emergencies that we had in the late 70s and then also during a drought from the late 80s through the early 90s really galvanized the urban sector to do a lot of investing in drought resilience. So tremendously diverse investments that have gone on in drought preparation, including new storage, including in the Bay Area, a lot of interties, so that all of the different systems are now connected and there's a possibility for emergency sharing. Also, a lot of long-term conservation programs were launched. Some of that water was saved in storage to be ready for droughts, and the state generally supported these kind of actions, both with matching grants and through some regulatory and legal changes. Now, this drought, we kind of came into that drought with some pretty good preparation, but as the drought wore on, the state was concerned that urban suppliers were not saving enough. In the early part of the drought, in 2014 particularly, the governor called for voluntary savings of 20%. And on average, statewide, the savings came in at about 10%. Now, it was quite varied around the state, and it turns out that the Bay Area was about 15% on average. You sort of saw more savings in places that had more shortages, actually. And so the state wasn't able to track that very well as to what was happening, and they were concerned that that we needed to do more. And so the governor, and this was a famous photo that was seen around the world in the media on April 1st, 2015, which was the last date of the official sort of snowpack measure for how our storage is doing for the summer. That's normally supposed to be snow there. There wasn't. So it was a good place to show that this was a really bad drought. It was a hot drought, and there was no snow. So they announced a mandate saying 25% savings on average. Those were rates that were varied depending on local conditions. And the reasons were given included ensuring against a longer drought, helping those in need, and changing social norms on water use, encouraging people to make some long-term changes. Californians responded immediately. I won't go into the details of this graph, but basically you can just sort of see that between the first and the second line there, right after the announcement of the mandate and before it even went into effect, people started saving a lot more water. The Bay Area, just for your reference, is that lower blue line. So per capita use here is lower to start with, similar to the Central Coast. The mandate, although people responded to it, posed challenges. And in particular, a lot of the local water suppliers were concerned about just the disconnect with their local programs, and they felt that it didn't. A lot of them felt that it didn't reflect their conditions. So this chart here shows you the results of our survey. We asked people. We call this the Goldilocks question: was the mandate, too much, too little, or just right? And only about a quarter said it was just right. Very few said it was too little. Most said it was much and too much, and 44% said it was much more than necessary. In the Bay Area, suppliers were more likely to say it was the right amount than in some other regions, but still a number of them felt that it was too much. And so after the mandate was relaxed in 2016, the state let suppliers take a different approach. We're saying that they could be taken off the mandate if they could show that they had enough supplies for 3 more years of drought. And over 83% of utilities were able to show that, and basically that they had enough supplies even with continued drought. They didn't need mandatory rationing. They still maintain voluntary programs in their areas, but they didn't. They got off of the sort of state requirement, and water savings remained high. They bounced up a little bit. The water use bounced up a little bit, but you can see those 3 graphs there. 24% savings during the mandate period, down to 25% to 20% in the self-certification period. So still pretty good. Not much rebound. Now, just quickly run through 5 lessons for you that we make recommendations about. The first is to coordinate drought contingency planning and implementation, and this is really a recommendation about state policy relative to local planning. And what we're suggesting is that rather than this sort of better safe than sorry mandate that the state put in that wasn't very well aligned with local conditions, the stress test approach, which we call a trust but verify approach, is a better approach, because basically it's requiring the local agencies to provide information about their conditions in a way that the state has access to it. The problem in this drought was in part that the state couldn't really well monitor what was going on. That's a useful thing for local communities to have as well. And we think that overall it's going to be better in terms of encouraging the right kind of incentives. The second, and this is something maybe that the panel is going to be have an opportunity to talk about, is continuing to boost water system flexibility and integration. We're going to continue to have population growth in many parts of the state. The climate is changing, and so we need to continue to we can't rest on our laurels in places that did well already. There has to be continued efforts on this. Regional integration is a big thing. It's helped a lot in a place like the Bay Area, but there's room for improving that still. And various kinds of new investments that folks are looking at, like using recycled wastewater, capturing and using stormwater in some regions, and so on. It's key that the state be clear on its policies in this regard, as well as that locals take leadership, especially large utilities that can play a big role in the regional context. The third is the need to improve fiscal resilience. We generally gave the local urban water agencies good marks in being drought resilient from a water perspective in terms of having the water and being able to manage demand. They did not do so well on the fiscal side. And this is the problem of when water use falls very quickly, a lot of times urban agencies can be in the red, and that's because so much of their costs are fixed costs that don't go down when they sell less water. And the savings were so great in many places that it really put urban agencies in trouble. On average, about 60%, a little bit more, of all utilities said that their net financial position went down because of the drought, and the mandate in the Bay Area was much higher. It was almost 3/4 of the Bay Area utilities that had financial problems because of the drought. And there are some issues here, both for what locals can do, but also what the state can do in terms of helping utilities to get past some of the constitutional challenges there are now in place in California for justifying the kinds of water rates that you have. I think the panel may talk about this more. The fourth, and if you remember, one of the reasons that the state gave for the mandate was also to help out, to kind of be in solidarity with folks that were really in trouble during the drought, addressing shortages in vulnerable communities and ecosystems. What we found was that this was not a very effective tool for that. Saving water in communities helped a lot with their own buffer for future dry years, but it did not really help very often with getting water to ecosystems or to the kinds of communities in the Central Valley, for example, that were on wells that were going dry, and because there's just no connection really between that savings in the large city and in the small communities. So we suggest here that and these are urgent problems, but there are other tools that are going to be important, and cities can definitely play a role in that, but the state needs to take a lead. Farms can also help with that. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that in the panel as well. And then the fifth, and this is one that is hard to sometimes communicate, is that there are trade-offs with conservation, and so we have to be mindful of that. And now everyone is really looking for the opportunity to kind of build on the savings in this drought and really kind of consolidate and kind of go further with long-term conservation as a way of accommodating population growth and just, having the urban sector put less pressure on our overall water resources. And that's a very important thing to do, but what one needs to remember is that that can involve trade-offs with being able to really compress water use quickly without too much harm during a drought. This little graph here shows you water use in 2015, that's the blue, and water use 2 years earlier before the conservation mandate in 2013 over the year. What you can see there is a hump. I think David Mitchell, my colleague, called it a camel's hump, and that camel's hump got kind of emptied of water in the time when the mandate came in. So you see all the water use that went down in the period with the mandate. That's because people cut their outdoor water use much more than they cut their indoor water use. That's kind of the reservoir right now in the urban areas for savings. That's a good thing to cut, but then you've got to recognize that you don't have it for a drought. In future droughts. So one of the ways to address the trade-offs is to make sure that some of the savings goes into a reliability reserve, and we gave some examples in the report of places that have done that. And you have to just think about this in terms of your planning. So it doesn't mean don't conserve, but it means think about that and be ready for what that means for your drought resilience strategy. I think I'm going to wrap up by saying that there's a lot of good work that was done during this drought to get cities and suburbs through it by the citizens, by the water managers, by the state, and we've got some good lessons for going forward. And I think the conversation that we're going to have now is going to be shedding a lot of good light on that for what we can do here in the Bay Area. And with that, it's my great pleasure to bring up. To ask up the mayor of Livermore, John Marchand. He's been mayor since, come on up, John, since November 2011, but he's a stealth water guy who came into the mayor's office, not really stealth, I guess. He's basically done pretty much everything in water. Started out as a marine biologist working on issues in the Bay, then was doing some wastewater treatment work, then was doing water quality management for Alameda County Water District, has been on the board of Zone 7, which is the wholesaler for water out in his neck of the woods, and he's been on the city council in Livermore. He's done things besides water there, including sort of cultural things and general planning and all of that, so he knows more than water, and now he's the mayor, and it's a really great opportunity to talk with somebody who's seen it from all sides. So, Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Those 5 points were great. I mean, that was the lessons learned, absolutely. That's so we're pretty much done here.
Okay, so now we get to hear about what's been going on in your neck of the woods, and I think I'm going to start with a question. There's a lot of variation across regions, also within regions, and Livermore is a different place from San Francisco, for example. So it'd be great for you to walk through a little bit the experience that you had in Livermore in this drought and some of the big takeaways.
Sure. Okay. So being from Livermore, I'm happy to say that this drought was not my first rodeo. I had been through this a number of times. I was through the 76, 77 drought. I was elected to the Zone 7 Water Board in 1990. And let me back up a little bit. I was elected to the Zone 7 board in 1990 after having spent about 15 years as a water quality chemist. I did both simultaneously. I was a water quality chemist for one water agency and was on the board of directors for another. While I was there, I implemented the Water Quality Policy Committee. I was twice chair. But I was elected in 1990, and then we had that was during the drought of 86 to 92. And on February 25th, 1991, we got a phone call from the Department of Water Resources. And they said, we got good news, we got bad news. The good news is you're going to take a 90% cut. You're getting 10% of your contracted amount. And I said, well, what's the bad news? He says, well, you've already gotten your allotment for the year. We're turning off the pipe tomorrow. So when you talk about the need to develop resiliency, that was a tremendous lesson that we learned. So one of the things that we did is we doubled our Table A entitlements. We also, we're very fortunate is we sit on a groundwater basin of about 250,000 acre-feet of drinking water. So that's a tremendous resource during the drought. Although while I was on the board, we developed policies that was not a water supply. That water in the groundwater basin, we would use that for peak demand, particularly in the summertime, and then we would draw that basin down in the summer and then recharge it during the winter time. So for ongoing demand, what we did is we acquired about 100,000 acre-feet out of the region. So we got 250,000 acre-feet under us, and we acquired another 100,000 acre-feet outside in the semi-tropic water bank. So we're in really, really good shape until the mandates came through, because we were ready for this. We were ready to be able to meet our demand. But when it was automatically a mandatory 25%, and then they shut off the State Water Project, we could no longer make withdrawals from the semi-tropic water bank because it's an in-lieu program. We give our water from the aquifer to LA, and then we take their order through the Delta. So because it was an in-lieu, we could not make the withdrawals that were necessary. Now, we already had I'm sorry, I use we a lot because when I was at the Zone 7 Water Board, we implemented, now, so 15 years is a long time to have to give up that but also the City Council. So at Zone 7, we had implemented a lot of drought resiliency plans in place, the Table A entitlements, the out-of-area recharge, or out-of-area storage, maximizing the use of the groundwater basin. And in the city of Livermore, we implemented our several tiers of water conservation. We had voluntary and then mandatory. And then we also implemented conservation rates. So as you pointed out, we didn't get hit as badly as some cities did because we already had those in place. So we were ready for that. During the drought of 86 to 92, Zone 7 drew down about $12 million out of our renewal and replacement allowance for our infrastructure, which became a drought stabilization fund to help us weather that drought. So a number of different mechanisms that were able to be used. Now Zone 7 has a drought rate stabilization fund separate from the renewal and replacement allowance to ensure that we can continue to avoid sudden rate spikes, which of course harm our constituency. You made a great point about the hardening the demand. This is something that we have seen during 76, 77. We got great response from the community. The 86 to 92 was also a great response. This one, we also had a tremendous response. Livermore led the state. We had 40% conservation in Livermore, 40%. But that came at a price because we had been conserving for a number of years. Now, when the call was made out to conserve, they'd already reduced their outside irrigation. We asked people to cut their outside irrigation by 50% and at the same time reduce the inside water usage between 10 and 20%. Again, we're looking for that 25%. Unfortunately, what happened is people thought, well, we'll just stop outside irrigation. Millions of dollars of landscaping died. You're not going to get that back in the next round of conservation requests. We also, even worse, long-standing mature trees died. So as I walk through the neighborhoods, these trees are dead. They're not going to come back. People aren't going to replant them. So this, of course, causes a greater heat sink in the urban environment. As people are removing their lawns and putting in rock, that again increases the amount of heat that's being contained in the cities, which then relates into higher power consumption. So really it was easy to get that initial conservation, but as we have hardened the demand, we've seen much greater impacts throughout the region.
So, and I guess I'd ask you to expand a little bit on, the Livermore public did respond big time, as you said, 40%. This is from one of the hotter places in the Bay Area and sort of one of the higher water using areas for that reason, even though you guys had been conserving over time. I think.
Yeah, we were 100 degrees on Wednesday.
Okay.
And we were also 107 the week before.
So what was the communication strategy with the public sort of during the drought and now kind of in the aftermath in terms of conservation, but also financial aspects? Well,
what we did is, first off, having gone through the first drought as a board member and having had your water usage published on the front page of the newspaper, you become very cognizant about your water usage. We've actually had some council members in neighboring cities that failed to meet the conservation efforts by their communities. We didn't have that problem in Livermore. We took it very seriously. And in fact, during my State of the City address, I showed my water bill during my State of the City and showed that I had reduced my water usage by 55%. So it's very important to lead by example, hauling those buckets back and forth from the shower and those sorts of things. So communicating very close collaboration with Cal Water, who is one of our retailers. The City of Livermore and Cal Water split the city as far as how we deliver water. We also have Dublin San Ramon Services District and the City of Pleasanton. So there's actually 4 retailers and 1 water wholesaler. So Zone 7 is the wholesaler. So we had very close collaboration working together. So we had a unified message. We had bill stuffers. We had ads in the newspaper. We had public outreach. We also had radio spots recognizing that we did, and we did such a great job that it actually began to impact our ability to manage the water quality and the water in our system. Tanks were not draining as they were supposed to during the day, so we could fill them at night. So we were losing chlorine. So we had more taste and odor problems. The water was becoming more stale. We weren't moving as much water through the system because people weren't using water. So it made it difficult from a water quality standpoint and from an operations standpoint because we just did too good of a job. And now we have seen, as you saw in the graph, people are not using water as they had before. So we've hardened that demand. And so we need to make sure that when the next drought happens, because we do live in a desert, that we can find other mechanisms to manage our water use and our water conservation.
So I want to give us time for talking with some Q&A with the audience, and then I'll if there aren't enough questions, then I'll come back with another one. So I think if folks have some questions for the mayor, now's a good chance, and we'll pass the mic over to you.
Well, if I could just one quick little point, because being at the Public Policy Institute, there's one policy discussion that we have not had. And I think it's very, very important because as we, as policymakers in this room, you've seen in the news, what is the #1 crisis that cities on the West Coast are facing today, especially Bay Area cities? Very good. Housing, everybody. It's affordable housing, workforce housing, that is critically important. However, during the height of the drought, we saw in the state of California that 90,000, that's 90,000 building permits were issued every year during the drought. That's 45,000 acre feet of new water demand. And we have not built a new impoundment for water in the state of California in over 30 years. Our population will double from 1990 to 2020. It's almost doubled. So we need to control how we're going to manage this. And instead, we've got 90,000 building permits, and this is why we have such rampant NIMBYism. Remember, I'm an elected official now, so 2 of my council members were voted out of office this last November because of a multi-housing unit that was proposed for my downtown. They were voted out of office because people don't want any more housing because of the failure of the state to maintain the infrastructure. And people are all about protecting their quality of life. And when they see their quality of life going down, they can't use water. And the little water they're going to get, they're going to have to pay more for. And at the same time, you're asking to add more housing. Now, the way I've explained that in my community is that we don't have a single pool of water that we draw from in Livermore. We draw from the State Water Project. But the State Water Project, over the last 3 years, has just, the permits, 270,000 new permits and no new water. So we really need to have a discussion with the state and start working on how does the state address the failing infrastructure, the failing water infrastructure, the failing transportation infrastructure, because as long as people see their quality of life degrading, they're going to continue to fight any attempt at bringing in the workforce housing that we so desperately need.
So basically, people are willing to save water, but not. But if they think that new housing is going to mean that that's going to impact on that in the future.
Right. Well, they're conserving water, which immediately then gets sold for new development. So where do you start to catch up on this? And people see their quality of life being impacted, which is why we're seeing such a backlash against any new housing in the region.
Got it. Well, so I do want to open it up for questions, but I'm going to editorialize.
I had to throw that out
a little bit, which is just I think. What you're saying gets a bit to our point about thinking about being clear on where long-term conservation, the role that can play, and sort of where short-term conservation comes in, and we have seen California as a whole be able, the urban sector, to be able to accommodate 8 or 9 million new people since the last major drought, with about the same amount of water. So, you know, there's a sense in which long-term conservation can help as long as we do it in ways that are where the quality of life remains good. And so I'm an optimist on the water piece of that puzzle.
But remember, this year we saw millions of dollars in landscaping die, which we hadn't seen in previous droughts. So yes, we were able to accommodate those 8 to 9 million more people, but we saw some more tremendous impacts, and you will not get that back on the next drought. They're already dead.
Got it. Okay, so questions, and I think lend my mic.
Sorry to run over you like that.
No, that's good. How old are you?
Okay. Yeah, Peter Vorster from the Bay Institute. So given you have, in the Tri-Valley area, a great groundwater basin, one of the better ones in the Bay Area to store water, what role does direct and indirect potable reuse, indirect for groundwater recharge, direct? I mean, in the future, that's one of your supply sources. So, and then also just relate that to what an individual can do for like on-site reuse, whether gray water or commercial. I mean, there's different ways to reuse water, but I think you guys are in a unique position for the indirect potable reuse, but I think direct is also in everyone's future.
Wow, the history comes back to me again. Okay, so
public perception. Deal with the public. How are you going to overcome that public perception?
Right. So there was this marvelous program down in San Diego that was called Showers to Flowers. God, don't you love that? When we were discussing the indirect potable reuse at the Zone 7 Water Agency in 1996, somebody actually they wheeled in a toilet that had a fountain attached. There was a faucet on the top that then flowed right into the bowl and back and forth circuit, and they had like antifreeze, so this evil green look to it. That was, and it was a toilet tap, right there, perfect. People had a warped sense of humor. So the interesting thing of it was, is in 1996, I actually killed the indirect potable reuse project in our area because there was tremendous public backlash against it, and about 75% of the public opposed it. So because the agency that was trying to do that had no groundwater wells, and they were going to be injecting their wastewater into my groundwater basin, which is 250,000 acre-feet. So if there was a mistake, if there was an oops, would it be up to them to clean up my basin? No, it's going to be up to me. And there were not sufficient controls in place. So the possibility of indirect potable reuse, the agencies are looking at that right now. We are on a regional roundtable. So we're looking at how do you sell that to the public? And there seems to be more acceptance around stream water recharge, environmental enhancement, perhaps surface water augmentation, as opposed to direct injection. Because if there is an oops, it's more difficult to pull that back. If you have it as surface water reservoir augmentation, you've got the hand of Mother Nature is upon it, so there's greater acceptance. But that's certainly one of the ideas that we're looking for, because diversification of the water portfolio is going to be critical to a long-term strategy.
One more question.
We'll scare them off eventually, I guarantee.
Thank you, Spreck Rosecrans, Restore Hetchy. I wanted to ask about your experience with semi-tropic, looking back. How do you feel about that investment? And also, Zone 7, at least to date, has not shown interest in the expansions of Los Vaqueros and its proposed pipeline to Byron Bethany and all that. And are you looking at that these days?
Well, I actually voted against going into Los Vaqueros Reservoir because... Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Wow. Okay. So, in a nutshell, okay, Los Vaqueros Reservoir was originally designed as about a 100,000 acre-foot surface water impoundment off-stream reservoir as a water quality reservoir, not a water supply reservoir. But Zone 7 had the opportunity to buy into that about 20,000 acre-feet for $55 million. I have a groundwater basin that's 250,000 acre-feet. I should say, Zone 7. Zone 7 has also the quarry recharge pits around that are another 80,000 acre-feet of capacity. So to spend $55 million for 20,000 capacity, which would require congressional approval to move it across the watershed, did not seem to be a good investment at the time. We've got plenty of water. We've got 350,000 acre-feet, which is actually about 2.5 times the size of the Los Vaqueros Reservoir. So if we can access that, that's why we haven't gotten into that. Is because we've got already good resources as well. So there was another half of that too.
The first half was you made an investment in semi-tropic.
Right.
How do you feel?
Well, I feel great about that.
Something.
Yeah, I feel good about that because it's been a good water management tool, and if the aqueduct is running, we can make those withdrawals, and we have made withdrawals in the past. So, but if it doesn't rain, that's not going to help you anyway. So we've seen that with like Oroville Creek, as we saw this last time around. It was just there just wasn't any water there. So it's going to be multiple resources and multiple solutions.
This is very much the idea of diversifying to have a kind of portfolio where you can have some resources you can draw on when others aren't available, basically. Right.
Diversification of the portfolio.
So I want to thank the mayor very much. Please join me. And you're going to be able to stay around for afterwards, so you can catch him later over coffee and cookies. And now I want to invite up Lauren Sommer, who's going to be moderating the next panel. Lauren is a science and environmental reporter with KQED, and if you ever listen to KQED or NPR stations, and you're interested in the environment, which I know you are because you're here, then I don't really need to say much about her because you know her voice and her reporting, but she's a real resource to California in reporting on all the kinds of issues that we face in water and beyond and in the environment, and so we're excited to have her here. Come on up, Lauren.
Okay, perfect. We actually are in order. Oh, no, wait, not quite. Almost. Well, thanks so much for coming today, and thank you to PPIC for having us. I think this wet winter, of course, has made the drought a distant memory for many Californians, right? I mean, it's amazing how fast that happened. But as we know, and it probably doesn't need to be said in this room, the droughts will come back. We will have more droughts. And there's certainly things that happened in this past drought that really will change the way that water is managed and delivered in California. And there are probably still some lessons that are very much still percolating, that we're still digesting. So today we want to talk a little bit about some of that stuff with our great panel. Just to let you know the order here. Sitting next to me, we have Alexander Coate, the general manager for East Bay Mud. Next, we have Steve.
Hi.
Steve Ritchie, SFPUC. Then we have Ken Jenkins of California Water Service, and then Peter Dreckmeyer for the Tuolumne River Trust. So just to kind of continue on some of the themes that we've already started on, covering the drought, I visited many water districts here in the Bay Area that financially did pretty darn well. They had drought rates set up, they had drought surcharges, they had the plans in place, and they kind of just kicked them in when the drought hit. I definitely visited some water districts that were in the red, were really feeling the financial hit from the drought. So I just want to talk a little bit for the folks that work in a particular water district. What was it like for you guys? How did you weather it financially? Did you have things set up that helped you get through?
Want to just take it down the line?
Yes.
All right. So for East Bay Mud, as we always do, we had a plan. And we had a lot of plans. So, and some of you have helped us prepare those plans. So going into the drought, from a financial perspective, we've been through it before. We had a rate stabilization fund set aside. We had been gradually reducing our expectations for consumption by our customers based on experience and projections. And then when we got a little bit into it, we went ahead and established a stage series of drought rates, had that all queued up so that when it got to the time where we had to declare a significant drought, we had a source of revenue. So we implemented a surcharge, and we did all of that through the Prop 218 process, which is cumbersome and time-consuming, and completed the associated cost of service study that you need to justify that we're asking customers to pay in proportion to benefit received. So we were pretty well squared away, and that got us through the drought. The costs for the supplemental supplies and the lost revenue were in great part offset by the surcharges that we imposed on our customers, which they, to a degree, willingly accepted. We also had excessive use penalties. We were probably the only water agency in the state to establish a threshold above which we viewed that an extra penalty was required. And you read about that in the paper, I'm sure. And so then subsequently, and you probably read about us in the paper last week, got out of the drought, consumption stayed low, and then we did as what we've been doing over the years, which is we rebaseline again, even lower, and in so doing had to adjust the rates because our costs are fixed in great part. So we got through it, and we're in pretty good stead going forward at this point. Of course, there's a little bit of pain as customers come to understand what's involved.
And as an East Bay Mud repair, I appreciate that.
I appreciate it. How many repairs in the room for East Bay Mud? Raise your hand. All right. Thank you for your support.
In San Francisco, we sell about a third of our water retail in San Francisco and 2/3 of the water wholesale outside of San Francisco. So for the wholesale customers, by our contract, we actually set the rates every year, partly based on what the prior year was like. So if we under-collected revenue, we can basically increase the rates to recapture that revenue in the following year, so it fixes itself every year. So for our wholesale customers, it was a pretty self-stabilizing fund during the drought. On the retail side, we had set multiple year rates. Both the last one was a 4-year rate package, and frankly, we crawled to the end of that. We're in the last year of it now, and we've managed to make it financially. So we're looking, starting next year, at another multi-year package because we do both wastewater and water in San Francisco. So it's a combined bill that we have to worry about making sure it stays affordable, but that we cover the costs we have. Also layered into this, despite John's comments about state infrastructure, we have been investing heavily in San Francisco's infrastructure to the tune of about $4.8 billion over the last 12 years. And that money, the debt service on that has really kind of overshadowed many other things. So we really have a large debt service component currently, which will be going down ultimately, but that is a big piece of our costs right now.
So Cal Water is a bit unique in that for the last 10 years, we've had what's referred to as a water revenue adjustment mechanism. And not to go into the gory details, if PPIC wants to have a half day or a full day panel on RAM, we can do that. But what it essentially does is it tracks the difference in what our sales are versus sales revenue is versus what we were projecting it to be. And it trues that up in either direction. So if we have higher sales and we collect more money than we're expecting to, we ultimately give that back to customers. And if we collect less, then we true that up and we collect that money from customers so that we have a stable revenue at all times. So that leads into the drought where over the last 10 years we've seen sales decline. And that's a good thing. We've decoupled sales from revenue, and it allows us to be much more aggressive on the conservation side. But what happens is that balance in the RAM increases over time because we're not collecting the same amount of revenue. We true that up on an ongoing basis. But when we hit the drought, that really increased those balances. And so we established water budgets for our customers, which included drought surcharges associated with exceeding those water budgets using 2013 as the baseline. And that had the effect of two different things. It impacted, we believe impacted usage, right? And so it was one other mechanism that we had in place to help reduce usage during the drought. But it also, the way we set the drought surcharge up is it paid for additional drought expenses as well as offset the balances in that particular RAM account. And so what we saw during the drought, rather than an increase in the RAM balance, which you would expect from a decrease in sales, we actually saw a decrease in that balance. And that was beneficial to customers, particularly those that conserved during the drought, because they received the benefit from those that were paying that surcharge and exceeding their water budget and not meeting that requirement. They all received that benefit. So this is all long planning. It takes a lot of work to do. But the interconnection between rates and how that's put together, I think, is extremely important.
Just a quick follow-up. You know, we do usually see some conservation stick after a drought. It's obviously still a little early, but I'm curious for the three of you, what's your sense on how much of that conservation is going to be permanent?
So for a dramatic effect, I'll run through a few numbers. So 10 years ago, we served 1.4 million customers. 10 years ago, they were utilizing 200 million gallons a day. And in fiscal year 16, we just finished 17, so a year ago, they were using 128 million gallons a day. So you can see pretty dramatic reduction in consumption. And then last year, we just closed out the fiscal year, they used 133, and our projection is 137 for fiscal year 18. That's the basis for the budget. And then going up for the next couple fiscal years by 4 MGD and then tapering to 2 after that. So we think there'll be a little bit of a rebound, but we don't project getting back to where we were before the drought for 10 years, if then. So that gives us time to adjust. Every couple of years we adjust our forecasts. If we haven't hit the mark, then we'll trend down. But that includes accounting for population growth, which was mentioned earlier, of which there is a significant amount in the service area. So we think that it's very reasonable. And that's the numbers way of saying that we really are in a new normal. We do expect, we don't ever expect conservation to go back to where it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, similarly, we had a pre-drought delivery of about 223 million gallons per day throughout our service area. It got to a low of about 175 million gallons per day. This year, we're looking at probably something that's going to be closer to 190 million gallons per day, so some rebound. I noticed Ellen's slide there showed the summertime hump, and it showed it had gotten down. There was still a hump there. For us, there was no hump. It was a flat line during the summer in the last 2 years, but we're starting to see some increases above that right now. I think, again, John mentioned it, one of the big things that we're looking at now is that, yes, per capita usage is going down, but if you believe Plan Bay Area and the projections that are being looked at by ABAG and MTC, by 2040, you're looking at some pretty substantial growth in the Bay Area, particularly in existing cities around the Bay Area. Oddly enough, Spur is having a discussion right now on Plan Bay Area where we're talking about water. Maybe we ought to have a joint session sometime to talk about these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, we're experiencing something similar across our 24 service areas in the state, which are all the way from Southern California up to Northern California, Bay Area, Central Valley. Depending on the time frame you look at, we were roughly at about a 28% or so reduction during the drought. We've been holding pretty steady since self-certification and into the beginning of this year at just over a 20% reduction across all of our service areas, so some rebound. But not a lot. This last month, so as we get into the hotter part of the year and some of our districts have much higher temperatures, we saw about an 18% reduction in the month of June. So even though we see a little bit more usage and less of a reduction, I would say, in the summer months as it looks right now, it's not significant. So we're holding fairly steady at the reductions that we were achieving during the drought.
Okay, so speaking of rebound, Peter, certainly the ecosystems, endangered species took quite a hit during the drought. We saw the State Water Board waive many of the environmental protections that are in place. Any rebound there? What are we seeing out there this past year?
Well, a little history, and then I'll answer your question. Our organization, Tuolumne River Trust, we were founded in 1981 when there was a proposal to build more dams on the Tuolumne that would have inundated the world-class whitewater run. And we secured wild and scenic status federally in 1984. So no new dams on the upper Tuolumne, 83 miles, and no development along the bank. So huge victory. We could have gone away, but the group decided to stay intact, and we've grown to become a watershed-wide organization. We have offices in Sonora, Modesto, and here in San Francisco. And the campaign that I focus on is called Revive the Tuolumne. It has two parts. One is use it wisely, so working with all the water agencies and consumers to encourage conservation and alternative water sources. And then the second part is let it flow, which is to make sure some of that water goes down the river. Right now, in an average year, only about 20% of the unimpaired flow, the natural flow, reaches the San Joaquin River. And before there were any dams on the Tuolumne, we had 130,000 salmon. Nowadays, we have in the low thousands and sometimes just a few hundred. Water quality is impaired. There are a lot of issues that we're trying to address. So in leading up to 2008, when the San Francisco PUC approved the Water System Improvement Program, which is $4.8 billion worth of seismic upgrades to make sure we could withstand a major earthquake, we supported that, but embedded in the proposal was a plan to divert an additional 25 million gallons of water from the Tuolumne eventually. And the environmental community was very opposed to that. We have a coalition called the Bay Area Water Stewards. And to their credit, the SFPUC came forward, their new general manager at the time, Ed Harrington, asked us if we would consider a compromise, which was to cap water sales until 2018 and to focus on creating 20 million gallons per day worth of water through conservation and recycling and groundwater. And so we met a number of times, and it was very fruitful. We came up with the compromise called the phased WSIP, Water System Improvement Program, and we all started working together. We had a common interest to encourage conservation, to make sure we had adequate supply, but also for environmental purposes. And just a few figures, back at the time, we were using about 257 million gallons per day. As Steve mentioned, before the drought, it was already down to 223. And last year it was 175. So We reduced our water use by 30% in a 10-year period, and we stayed 32% below the cap, so it was never really an issue. And we felt like our role was to provide the why. The water agencies provide the how, rebates and model ordinances, et cetera. The why is we have a very, very valuable resource here in the Tuolumne River that people really care about. There was a survey done by San Jose State University that found that protecting the environment was the #1 motivator for conserving water. And so we created a program called the Silicon Valley Water Conservation Awards. We celebrate on World Water Day. Next year will be our 10th anniversary. We started a program called That's the Tuolumne My Tap for elementary school students. We introduce them to their river, why it's so special, and then we send them home to educate their parents and their communities. And we've made a lot of progress on the water conservation part, but the flip side, the let it flow, we haven't. And people conserve to protect the environment, but often that's not the case. What happened during the drought was that San Francisco PUC has what I would call a pretty conservative drought plan, a design drought, where they're preparing for an 8.5-year drought that would be a combination of the 87 to 92 drought of record and then the two driest years on record, 76, 77. So every year they are planning as if it's the beginning of this design drought or the middle of it. And during the drought, they only released as much water as was required. And then this year, there was so much water in the system that it had to be dumped. And from January until May, water was released in the Tuolumne at the maximum amount they could without causing flooding downstream. So that wasn't bad for the environment, but if that water had been apportioned through the drought, it would have benefited the ecosystem, and right now we'd be in the same situation we are. At the height of the drought, we still had 3 years' worth of water in storage, so we weren't close to running out of water. But the planning really prevents releasing that water into the river. And so the Tuolumne really suffered during the drought, super critically dry years. The Bay Delta suffered. This year was just amazing. It was so beautiful to go to the Tuolumne and see these floodplains inundated. And that's where the juvenile salmon rear and eventually get flushed into the bay. It felt like being on the bay in some parts of the San Joaquin River. So I think we're probably going to talk a little bit more about the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan later, but the ecosystem needs to feel some of the benefit when we conserve water.
We'll talk about it now. How about that? So for those of you not familiar, I mean, this water quality control plan, I covered it last year. The headline we put on the article at KQED was the biggest California to water decision you've never heard of. To me, this is one of the more fascinating things that's happening in the state in water right now, which is the State Water Board is looking at the 3 tributaries that go into the San Joaquin River, and they're setting essentially flow criteria, how much water needs to be in there for the environment. The kind of analogy I like to use is that, a lot of the things you hear about, the limits on the pumping in the Delta, that's like the emergency room triage, right, for endangered species. This is a more holistic approach, looking at what would this ecosystem need, what would you need for the health. But obviously, there's a lot of people who are involved with this decision and their water supply. So just to kind of briefly talk about it, Steve, starting with you, what was your take on what the Water Board proposed? And then you guys have come up with your own plan. Maybe you can describe it a little bit. Sure.
I've been toying with what I'm going to say about the State Water Resources Control Board here. And I'll say some of it. I think there's a distinct lack of trust in the State Water Resources Control Board by water agencies because they have a lot of, oh, trust me, in the documents they put out. The San Joaquin Water Quality Control Plan is a good example of that, where they talk about we should be releasing 40% of unimpaired flow into the rivers, but don't worry, we'll make adjustments and it'll all kind of work out, which they're trying to be all things for all people, and they're being nothing for an awful lot of people, and that's problematic. We needed to get to specifics in it because it was kind of a meat cleaver approach to, if you put a lot of water down the river, undoubtedly there will be more fish. And I don't think that's the way to deal with it, especially in dry and critical years. The issue is not in wet years like this. As Peter mentioned, this is a huge year in water. This water, there's no place to put this water, so it's going to go out the system, that's fine. But in dry and critical years, it's a real challenge for us, both in terms of managing the river and in terms of managing our supplies. And so what's going to happen in those years is really, really important. So when we looked at our comments to the State Water Resources Control Board, we said that kind of approach doesn't work for us. A big chunk of unimpaired flow is no commitment to anything really happening on the river and too much of a hit on water supply. So we proposed a combination of what we call non-flow factors, different ways to improve and manage habitat, together with functional flows, what we call functional flows, which are surgically directing flows to work in concert with those non-flow measures, which are habitat improvements, predation management. And when I say predation management, I don't mean go out and slaughter every striped bass out there. I mean really focus on key times of the year to manage predators in the system, because it is a fish-eat-fish world out there. Big no doubt about that. But if you put a package together like that, you can have a more efficient use of the water and produce more fish on the Tuolumne River, and we believe our proposal can accomplish that. I think there are other issues to deal with going down the Bay Delta, which is another issue, but we only divert about 0.7% of the water tributary to the Bay Delta. So there are a lot bigger issues out there than what San Francisco might provide. So I think we have a lot of conversation to have about that. But we put that proposal forth as a way to forward the conversation about, let's get serious about what we're going to do, instead of make sweeping statements like, you're too conservative on your planning. We got to put a lot more water down the river. Those things don't get us to management decisions that are going to be hard for all of us. They're going to cost money and they're going to cost water. All those things need to be taken into account. So we're now having everybody wrote huge reams of comments to the State Water Board. We're waiting to hear their response. In the meantime, a number of us are engaged in various discussions to try to come up with potential basis for a negotiated settlement of different issues. That's going to be a challenge by itself, but that's a brief version of something that people are dedicating months, years, decades of work to work around the issues.
Peter, to get your take on both what the Water Board proposed and what San Francisco is proposing.
So the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan was required by the Clean Water Act. It's supposed to be updated every 3 years, but the last time there was a substantial update was 1995, so we're behind on that.
Actually reviewed every 3 years, not updated.
So about 5 years ago, the State Water Board produced a flow criteria report that determined 60% of the unimpaired flow on the San Joaquin and its tributaries would fully protect fish and wildlife. It wasn't recommending 60%, but saying in the absence of other beneficial uses, that's what the science tells us. What was proposed last September is 40% of unimpaired flow between February and June, which are critical months for juvenile salmon, with some flexibility to move as low as 30% or as high as 50% if measures to achieve biological goals and objectives are effective. So what the San Francisco PUC alternative is focusing on is what we call non-flow measures, things like controlling invasive predator fish, habitat restoration, and those are all good things. And if the Bay Delta plan goes through as planned, and those are successful, they could go as low as 30%. We've modeled what would happen if we had the drought of record, 87 to 92, in a new world with the plan in place. And we found that San Francisco could manage that 6-year drought with modest conservation. No rationing in the first couple of years because you don't know if you're in a drought, 10% in years 3 and 4, and 20% in 5 and 6. And we can manage that. It's easier to look in hindsight and say, hey, we could manage the last 100 years of hydrology. It's much more challenging. Steve's in the position of looking forward, and we have climate change and population growth, other issues. So we're sympathetic to that. But the state has embraced co-equal goals of ensuring reliable water supply and improving aquatic ecosystems. So those are supposed to be on the same level, and we haven't seen support from the water agencies for providing more water into the river. And it could be functional flows that, certain timing, but the river needs more water. The rivers do. Flows impact everything from water temperature, which is really critical, dissolved oxygen. It inundates floodplains, which are critical rearing habitat for juveniles. Pulse flows attract the mature salmon back into the river to spawn. Pulse flows help the juveniles move out into the ocean. Even predators are impacted by flows. Higher flows create murkier water. The juveniles have a better chance of escaping from predators. Also, predators have evolved in different ecosystems. Bass are used to slow-moving warm water. We've altered the Tuolumne ecosystem to the point that it favors non-natives over the natives that like fast-moving cold water. If it is cooler, the bass don't spawn, and that solves that issue. So I admire Steve. I know he cares about the environment. He's got a very challenging position, and we've worked well together in the past. Right now, I think we have a difference in opinion. Our feeling is, yes, let's do the non-flow measures. We obviously need more water in the river, and let's do adaptive management. That if we can make things work, if we can meet established goals and objectives with less water, that meets our needs. But we think that more water is essential.
So, you want to?
I would chime in too. We're also, but if you'd like to proceed. So East Bay Mud has responsibility for the McCullumne River. And while the San Joaquin and the Tuolumne are part of Water Quality Control Plan Phase 1, the McCullumne and the East Side Tribs are part of Phase 2, along with the Sacramento River. And so we'll be engaged. We anticipate that the State Board is going to be issuing its Phase 2 plan here. And they'll be mandating, as they did with Phase 1, a true natural flow-based approach. But our hope is that the 20-year track record that we have managing the river under a paradigm where we adjust flows based on year types, and we make decisions about how we're going to use the water in partnership with the resource agencies, those being California Department of Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That approach will be viewed as positive and appropriate going forward. The McCullumne is about 2%. It's actually a fairly small river, 2% of the flow that goes into the delta. But the practices that we've been employing in partnership with the resource agencies and UC Davis and others have resulted in our fry contributing 10% of the ocean catch in recent years. And we've had during this drought, despite the low water flows, exceptional fish returns for a river its size. So long-term average has been about 4,000, and we've seen well above 10 for the last 5 years. And so we view that that's a testament to best managing the river for the environment, and that true natural flow is again, sort of like what happened during the drought, a very crude approach, because if you let all the river out, all the water out, during the time that it's flowing naturally, and you don't take advantage of storage and prudent release approaches and pulse flows, et cetera, you're not going to have any cold water for the fish when you get into a few years of drought. And it's that cold water that you really have to manage judiciously in order to ensure that there's a high level of survival for those eggs that are going to be hatched in the river. So our hope is that the good work that we've done will really serve as the basis for what we get asked to do in the future. And I think we talk, all of the Bay Area agencies talk. That is what San Francisco and Peter also have in mind, something that strikes a good balance and makes best use of a precious resource.
It's very much a stay tuned situation here.
Yes.
How exciting.
It is exciting. It's very exciting. So maybe then building on that there are pressures on the supply, whether it's regulations down the road, whether it's growing population. So maybe let's chat a bit about this idea of diversifying the supply. Southern California gets a lot of credit because of the potable reuse programs they put in place. Where is the Bay Area? Where are you guys on those types of projects? What do you see coming down the road in terms of diversifying?
You want to go first, Steve?
Well, in San Francisco, we're diversifying our supply right now, and there are some people who are very pleased with that, and there are some people who are unhappy with that because we've done a very good job of selling our Hetch Hetchy regional water supply as being a very high-quality supply. We actually are currently completing construction on 4 groundwater wells on the west side of San Francisco, where we have a nice little groundwater basin, and starting to add a small quantity of groundwater to the supply. People are nervous about that because it's change. And change is frightening no matter where you are. But we think that's a very good resource choice to help start to diversify our supply. But it's just a small piece of it. We also are, San Francisco had the first recycled water plant in California that built in 1925, took it offline in 1981. So we're getting ready to build our second recycled water plant with about 30 years of a gap in there to actually irrigate Golden Gate Park and other areas. Golden Gate Park is currently irrigated with groundwater that can be used for potable supply. So basically, we're shifting to the right quality of water for the right use. Irrigation, you shouldn't use potable groundwater. You shouldn't use Hetchy water. You should use recycled water if you can. So that's what we're going to be doing there. We're also looking at other possibilities with East Bay Mud, Contra Costa, and others in what we call the Bay Area Regional Reliability Project. And maybe Alex may want to say more about that, but it's kind of an unprecedented level of cooperation among water agencies in the Bay Area to evaluate possible ways to diversify our supplies and enhance the reliability of them.
And so for East Bay Mud, as I mentioned earlier, we always have a plan. So we were one of the first agencies back in the late 80s, early 90s to develop a water supply management program that looked to, drawing on the experiences of the drought that we had just gone through, diversify our water supply portfolio in a thoughtful way. And because we really do have enough water in wet and normal years, from the McCullamy system, but it's in dry years, which are ever more frequent, that we really have to have alternatives to turn to. And so that plan that looked to the year 2020, the sort of the cornerstone of that plan, or what came out of it, because when you're planning in the water supply arena, if you pursue projects sequentially, like we're going to go after this, you'll find that most of the projects are not successful. It takes a long time to do something. So we pursued half a dozen projects concurrently, and the one that stuck was this Freeport Regional Water Project that allows us now, because it's been constructed and came out of that first water supply management program effort, to take water out of the Sacramento River in dry years. And we were able to utilize that, and it turned out to be a very prudent investment as a part of the last drought. But there were other things, and so groundwater in San Joaquin County is an example. They have a very overdrafted groundwater basin there, and the McCullamy River runs through it. And so back in the late 1990s, there was a fair amount of opposition. There wasn't the political will to do a conjunctive use project where you would allow the farmers to take water off the river in wet years and allow groundwater levels to accrue or increase at the same time. But it's funny how time and a series of significant droughts can really change things. And it was only earlier this year in April that the San Joaquin County Board of Supervisors approved an export ordinance and a pilot project that allows the use of McCullamy River water by San Joaquin County and putting in lieu application of water into the groundwater basin. And then East Bay Mud will be able to take 50% out during a future dry year. So with so much, with the tailwind of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and expectations for managing groundwater basins sustainably, there's a really strong tailwind that is going to make that project, and that basin holds 1 million acre-feet of water. That's how the degree to which it's been depleted, make a project like that successful. And then we are working, and actually we have Jenny Gain here from the California Urban Water Agencies who has some flyers if you're interested later. We're working on a Bay Area regional reliability effort, which involves 8 agencies in the Bay Area, Steve and I, and we've got Jerry Brown here from Contra Costa Water District and others, looking at how we also each have our own plans, our own urban water management plans now, that's what they're called, that talk about all of what we're doing as independent agencies to be reliable for the future. And now what we've done is we've taken a look at what we each have, and we're seeing, well, how can we optimize? If we're not all using what we have all the time, well, maybe we can do some sharing and interconnecting, and in so doing, make sure that we build whatever we build, that it has more value than just for one agency, but can serve the 6+ million people in the San Francisco Bay Area as a whole. So we're really getting the best bang for the buck, so to speak. So a lot of work in reliability, and We were ready for this drought, despite what it might have seemed. When I say we, the Bay Area water agencies were ready for this drought, despite what it might have seemed based on the media and the state's actions. The state was really focused on smaller agencies that didn't have the resources and hadn't invested in the planning. We were ready for this drought. We've been around for almost 100 years. This is not the first time that we've had to deal with this. And we're going to be ready for the next one. And I can assure you that the Bay Area water agencies are going to make sure that there's water here for the next 100 years. So, and a diverse portfolio is going to get us there.
The one thing I would add is the projects that we found to be most beneficial for us are, in large part, projects that we've partnered on and that bring in multiple agencies to be a part of. We've looked at things like recovery of brackish groundwater in some of our districts, looked at groundwater in general in our districts. We have about 10% of our use is from groundwater in our South San Francisco district. Our Mid-Peninsula district doesn't really have what we found there is that the yield that we can get from groundwater just isn't cost effective for what we'd have to put into a project. But we've partnered with SFPUC on groundwater recovery and groundwater storage project. It's been something that we're really proud of and think can be very beneficial moving forward. I think along those lines, something akin to a local resource program. I know Metropolitan Water District of Southern California has a local resource program where they help to fund a portion of local programs. Being able to get us over the hump on some of these projects that may not be cost effective otherwise, like brackish groundwater, like recycled water, where for us, we'd have to build a pipeline that's significant to bring recycled water into some of our service areas. There's a huge upfront cost to that. By having some other funding mechanism that can ultimately benefit the region by taking stress off the system and helping develop those local resources, we think is something that can be explored going forward and something that we could see potentially supporting in the future. Yeah.
But just quickly, prospects for direct or indirect potable reuse, anything? Is it a long-term thing? Is it?
It's a long-term thing, but I think we've seen more discussion in the water industry about indirect and even direct potable reuse in the last 10 years than in the prior 100. People are actually serious about it. I would make one comment about Southern California and lovely Orange County. They've been putting wastewater into the groundwater basin for decades because they overdrafted the groundwater basin and had a seawater intrusion problem. So they had to solve a problem. Now they're turning it into a supply and taking credit for it, but they had to do it because they screwed something up in the first place. So you got to be careful of those things. Also, no matter what project it is, it takes a long time to develop projects. The conjunctive use project that Ken mentioned, the first correspondence on that project was in 1993. The project, the agreement among us to actually carry it out, finally in the midst of construction, was in 2014. So it was 21 years from the bright idea to actually having a project that isn't still operational. It should be operational in the next year. So it takes a long time to do these projects. It's a lot of outreach to the community about what they're going to be doing, but there's lots of problems to be solved between agencies and permitting issues and any number of things to deal with. So yeah, I think we'll get to direct potable reuse, but it's going to be a long time just because it always is a long time.
I think we are making good progress on conjunctive use of advanced purified recycled water and groundwater. And as Steve mentioned, Orange County was the pioneer. They actually produce 100 million gallons per day of water for reuse. The Santa Clara Valley Water District recently came online with an advanced purification facility. It uses microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet light to essentially create distilled water, drinking water. And it's 8 million gallons per day, and they're hoping to ramp it up to about 32 million gallons per day. I see the recently retired Jim Fiedler here from the district and Eric Olson here. What they're doing with the water right now is they're blending it with the tertiary treated recycled water to bring down the salt content, and then you can apply it to redwoods and other sensitive species. But eventually, they're going to do indirect potable reuse and let it filter down into the groundwater basin. They've got a good groundwater basin there. And eventually, the goal is to do direct potable reuse. Got to overcome the yuck factor. But I point out to people, all of our water is recycled. It's just whether Mother Nature does it for us or we do it ourselves. And we should really appreciate that ecosystem service that we get from nature. Where I think there's real potential is, Alex mentioned the groundwater basins in the San Joaquin Valley. And San Francisco has an interesting relationship with the two irrigation districts that get water from the Tuolumne, Modesto, and Turlock irrigation districts. They were the first water agencies in the state, so they have senior water rights. San Francisco was a newcomer back in 1913. So the way it works is, the first chunk of water coming down the river belongs to the irrigation districts. Anything above that, San Francisco can capture. So during droughts, it's very, very challenging for the SFPUC, but in normal and wet years, they can capture a lot more water than they need. But they have limited storage space. So they partnered with the irrigation districts in the 60s to build Don Pedro Reservoir, which is 5 or 6 times as big as Hetch Hetchy. And what San Francisco got out of it, they can't access that water, but they have a water bank there. So in a year like this, the water bank fills up 1.5 times as much water as Hetch Hetchy. And then in a dry year, they can capture water as it comes down when they're not entitled to it, but they subtract an equal amount from the water bank. So it's a very clever project. And where we think there's potential is to partner on a groundwater recharge program in Stanislaus County. And San Francisco might help pay for it in exchange for a groundwater bank there to ensure a more reliable water supply. So this year, there was so much water coming down the Tuolumne that even if 40% of the unimpaired flow made it down the river between February and June, as proposed by the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, on top of that, enough water was released to provide all the water that San Francisco and the irrigation districts would need for over a year. So there was a lot of extra water in the system. And in years like this, it would make a lot of sense to capture some of that water in one of our great storage facilities, which is the groundwater basin. So there's $2.7 billion in the state water bond for storage projects. A lot of irrigation districts think, damn, we can see that water. But where the real potential is recharging these overdrafted aquifers. And that, I think, is going to be the next big wave in water supply.
So I have one last question for the panel, and then I'm going to throw it open to you guys, so get your questions ready. A bit of a lightning round. We'll keep it short. For this drought, what was one bright spot for you personally, maybe a moment of innovation or success that just really sticks out in your mind? And then for the next drought, what's your biggest concern? What's the biggest issue to tackle? I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I'll go down the line. So in terms of a bright spot, is that, while we had all these plans, things didn't actually work out exactly the way we planned. But what we were able to do is tap into longstanding relationships with rice growers and bring in water that essentially offset the water that we weren't able to get through the Central Valley project because of much reduced allocations, or from the McCollum because of curtailment that came in as the drought got more severe. So we knew we would use it someday, but it was very exciting to actually be able to draw on those partnerships and use the facilities. For the future, for us, I think we're going to be embarking just in a few months with our board in a conversation about long-term financial stability, and one of the areas that we'll be talking about is rate stabilization funds. We have one, and it was very helpful to get us to the next budget cycle, but just how are we going to structure ourselves to be more, even more resilient going into the next drought? So that's an area of emphasis.
Yeah, the bright spots for me was exactly the drought planning scenario that we base our activities on for getting through a drought. And so, yes, Peter said we had 3 years of water left. And for me, we had 1 year of water left before I had to put the pedal to the metal to do something really drastic to make supply happen. In 2 years is a really short period of time. So it worked exactly the way it was intended to, and I would see it working that way again in the future. Looking to the future, more diversification. In San Francisco, we're right now looking at large new developments having to reuse water on site. That's going on with a lot of new developments out there. We're currently in conversation with 4 different wastewater treatment entities on potential indirect and direct potable reuse projects, so that there are conversations there. Peter's suggestion about conversation about conjunctive use with the irrigation districts, I think, is a very promising one. So I think there's lots of opportunity there, but they all take hard work and a long time. But that's going to be the future, diversification of supplies.
Yeah, I think for us, a bright spot was the cooperation and partnership with the cities that we serve and our customers. The Livermore mayor mentioned, we serve a portion of Livermore as well as the city, and we came up with a unified message in Livermore that was highly successful, and we wouldn't have been nearly as successful if we hadn't done that. And we think that is something that's important, not just in times of drought, but on an ongoing basis, is have those positive working relationships that can address many of the challenges that we have, and we're very hopeful that we can continue to do that. As far as looking forward, I think there's something interesting. I'll choose something different because I could say diversification of supplies and number of financial stability and all that too. But something different that came out of the PPIC report, specifically in the deep dive into our service areas, was this issue of impact that the drought had on low-income customers. And didn't go into a huge amount of depth, but it did kind of lay the groundwork for what that looks like and what we should be looking at in the future. And I think that's something, whether it's through direct install programs for low-income customers to help them reduce their use and meet certain requirements. Our drought surcharge that we implemented was for our low-income customers was 50% of that for all of our other customers. So we found a way to help try to address that. But going forward, how do you minimize the impact on lower income customers and customers that may be at risk?
A fun little story. Our program, That's the Tuolumne My Tap, we reach about 5,000 kids a year. And we approached the Palo Alto Community Fund for a small grant and met with them, and they asked, well, it's like, what are the results? What comes out of this? And we said, well, our real goal is to plant seeds. It's to introduce them to their river, teach them how to pronounce it, Tuolumne, Tuolayu. Teach them that more than half of their body is Tuolumne River water, so they carry it with them everywhere they go. And they did give us the grant, and one time I was at a party, and a friend from high school was there and said, hey, did you talk about the Tuolumne River to Walter Hayes School? And I said, yeah, I was there last week. So yeah, my son came home, and he was telling us all about the Tuolumne, and then I walked into the bathroom, and there was a bucket in the shower. and oh, I'm on the board of the Palo Alto Community Fund. So that message got back, and I do run into a lot of friends who their children see the presentation, they go home and they talk about it. I think that awareness is up so much because of the drought. We've seen a lot of initiatives. There's a groundwater assessment in San Mateo County, groundwater assessment and an indirect potable reuse study in Palo Alto area. Just lots of things happening. So we need to keep that momentum and make sure that conservation is a way of life in California.
Questions? Raise your hand, please. I'll hold it for you.
Thank you. The closest that we've gotten to the word agriculture in this room so far has been the use of groundwater. I'm wondering the materials that were set out before the meeting, talked about the how much more water agriculture uses than urban use. It seems like a place for a diversification of supply.
Well, agriculture in California surprises a lot of people. It accounts for about 2% of our economy. Most people would probably guess a third because it's such a powerful influence. But it uses 80% of the developed water. And where I think we need to focus is that water in California is a public trust resource. It belongs to the people of California. And you can make an argument that growing food for Californians is a great beneficiary use of our water. But when we're exporting produce overseas, we're essentially exporting water. And 25% of the crops grown in California are exported overseas. So where I think we need to go is charge a fee for that. It's a public trust resource, and we should bring in some revenue for projects such as irrigation improvements, groundwater recharge. So we're really incentivizing the better use of that water.
Are you going after to help President Trump renegotiate trade agreements? Couldn't help myself.
One problem is that, there are these cargo ships coming over from China with lots of goods, and then they're empty going back. So why not fill it up with alfalfa for, cow production back in China? So a lot of these issues are really interconnected. But again, we need to protect our public trust resource.
I might just add that when I was making my closing comments, that in fact we do partner with agriculture. East Bay Mud does, and so they can make a decision about whether or not to grow rice. We have options in the last year to purchase water from senior water rights holders, and so then in the month of March we can decide if we want to pay for that water at the going rate or whether we have sufficient supplies. And that's early enough that they can decide to not grow a crop and instead let the water flow down the river. And we're situated in a location where letting it flow down the river, we can also work with the Bureau of Reclamation to decide when it should flow so it provides environmental benefit. So there are situations where you can achieve, that's sort of a win-win-win. You can help the farmer make money, you can help the fish, and you can also provide water for urban customers. And I know that we're not unique in that, but that those are options that are in play right now.
Next question.
Hi, I come from Israel, where the Bible promised us that following the 7 bad years, we will have 7 good years, and we are still waiting. But in the time being, we took some, an holistic or comprehensive approach to our water issues. And I wonder if perhaps some of these can be adopted here as well, incentives for efficient irrigation. I mean, we spoke about the percentage of water which is used by agriculture in California. In Israel, 75% of the irrigation is drip irrigation. We reuse 90% of our sewage water for irrigation. So for the time being, before stopping agriculture in California, which I don't believe will happen, why don't we try to give incentives to farmers to move to more efficient methods?
Well, we always point to Israel and Australia for the examples of water conservation. I'll tell you one challenge is that water is underpriced. In the Modesto irrigation district area, for example, they charge farmers about $15 an acre foot. Here in the Bay Area for Tuolumne River water, we pay over $1,500 per acre foot. And there's actually a lawsuit in Modesto from the electric customers who are saying, hey, you're charging us extra to subsidize the farmers because they're only paying about 20% of the cost of delivering it. So I think you need to have price signals that make it make sense to do drip irrigation or other practices. And right now the water is just so cheap. And part of it is that they want farmers to use a lot of water and do flood irrigation because it's part of their recharge program for groundwater. So that's an argument there. But certainly, one thing that drove this amazing water conservation in the SFPUC service territory is that we had to pay off these $4.8 billion worth of seismic upgrades. And so the price of water doubled or tripled. So there really was a price signal.
One interesting project, though, in Modesto is it's in the planning stages, but water from the sewage treatment plant, tertiary treated water, is going to be going to an agricultural water district, which has taken them a long time to get that project going, but an interesting way to reuse water in the Central Valley. Next question.
Hi. So the mayor from Livermore earlier today brought up the connection between housing and some of the issues we've talked about. I'm also interested in talking about energy and the state's climate goals in connection to some of these issues. So as we talk about diversifying supply and perhaps creating more interconnections and possibly moving water across greater distances or having to put more energy into pumping groundwater, I guess I'm concerned about what the sort of life cycle cost is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and energy required to get us the water we need. So I'm just wondering how this is fitting into, in terms of the energy and climate impact, how this is fitting into your planning for diversification.
I could answer, so both Steve and I have the benefit of being responsible for systems that were engineered, near a century ago that are primarily gravity feed systems for the base supply that we use most of the time. So in comparison to, say, just systems in Southern California that have to pump over the Tehachapi's, our energy use on a per acre foot basis is much lower. So that's sort of a starting point in terms of framework. Our organization is very thoughtful, and I know others are as well, about energy use. Is very important. We have a sustainability committee. We have a goal and we track very closely our direct and indirect emissions associated with our operations, not just the water treatment, but even the trucks and the fleet and all of that, with a goal that we want to get to zero by the year 2040. And so, in fact, we have a presentation at the upcoming sustainability committee to talk about where we are, and we did very well. So we think about it in everything that we do, and that would be a reason why you might defer taking action on something like desal until the research and technology can make that more energy effective, and advance something that is less energy intensive. So that's definitely a very much a part of our thinking and cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I agree totally. Same thing for us. In fact, we compared, I don't remember, but it's like megawatt hours per million gallons or something like that is a common methodology. And for our Hetch supply, totally driven by gravity and generates hydro on the way, it's a negative number. When you compare it to groundwater pumping and recycled water, where we do have to actually remove the salt from the recycled water for going to Golden Gate Park, and desalinating brackish water from the Delta, they were all about on a par in terms of energy usage, but we want to look at that critically as compared to desalinating ocean water, which would be a much higher energy use. And then compare that to, frankly, pumping to San Joaquin Valley and Southern California, where that lift puts them an order of magnitude higher in energy cost, which is a challenge that we've got to face as a state. But for individual agencies, I think we're like Alex. We pay attention to it in everything we do.
Next question.
Hi. So we've talked about a lot here that water reuse and using our wastewater is a great opportunity, and there's room for growth there. Unfortunately, especially in the Bay Area, so much of our wastewater treatment is right on the bay or on the ocean, so that in order to reuse that water, we'd have to pump it back uphill. Technology has also improved the energy efficiency and the size efficiency of water treatment. So I'm curious what kind of thoughts you guys have with regard to decentralized water treatment so that it can better be reused.
Well, we're definitely doing more of that in San Francisco. As I said, the large new developments are obligated by ordinance. Anything greater than 250,000 square feet has to look at recycling water on their own site. And so we're doing that there. We have looked at the idea of scalping plants at different times. San Francisco is challenged by not having a lot of non-potable uses out there in the neighborhoods. We have a big Golden Gate Park and a lot of dinky little parks. So there's not that great an opportunity there. I know some of our customers outside of San Francisco have looked at it as well. But going back to the energy question, they're all down at the shoreline for a reason, because it took gravity to get there. And so they're more energy efficient that way. And now we have to pay a price for that if we want to actually make use of that resource.
Stanford University is planning a scalping facility on campus just for that reason. They think that they can capture their water instead of sending it all the way down to the bay and pumping it back. And they think they can produce about 500,000 gallons per day. And then there's another project. There's the Sharon Heights Golf Course in Menlo Park. They wanted to use groundwater, and the community said, no, groundwater belongs to all of us. It's too precious for watering a golf course. So they're partnering now with the wastewater treatment plant, but not with the plant. They're actually going to be capturing water coming out of the hills from the communities of Woodside and Portola Valley, and then directing that over, recycling it a little bit and using it for irrigation. So there's some things happening, and I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think I had mentioned before the fact that from a recycled water standpoint, our investigations have been, we'd have to build a 2-3 mile pipeline to get it from an existing plant, which in the scheme of things, tend to be relatively smaller treatment plants across the areas that we serve. And so things like scalping plants and things like that can be more local and not have to develop that type of infrastructure, which then puts additional stress from a financial standpoint. It either makes the program not cost effective, or it makes it not cost effective. The question is whether you move forward with the project and eat some of those costs going forward, or if it delays the project or there's other issues associated with it. So I think unique situations like that may call for unique solutions as well.
Could I throw in one quick observation? Going back to Ellen's presentation, I haven't heard the state mentioned at all in this talk about what we're doing in the future. Not that we don't need the State Water Board to help us along, but at this level, you have to innovate. You have to be ahead of the curve. You can't wait for the state to tell you what to do. So if the state doesn't trust us enough to do it and figures they have to set standards, I think they're barking up the wrong tree. You know, the trust but verify approach, I think, is the one that I liked about the report. This isn't just to plug PPIC in the report, but it was a good report because I think I agreed with a lot of it because it did say, yes, there's a role for the state, but it's not a paramount role.
Last question.
That's a lot of pressure. Good afternoon, Remy Goldsmith, Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I promise I'll give you back the microphone if you want to let go. Okay. I understand. I've been there. So I have a slightly different question. SVCF has done our own research on drought resilience in Silicon Valley. And one of the challenges we found for the people who live in that community are they go from one jurisdiction to another, and there's different messages about meeting drought mandates. Different jurisdictions all have different expectations, and then there's the state saying one thing. Since I have 3 different water utilities perspectives here, what would you say is a solution for having a more unified message that the average utility user could meet better?
Well, that's a very good point. I think when the state sort of usurped the role of local agencies in messaging around the drought, that's exactly what they did. They just took over and started explaining what they wanted and asking for 25%. But then the reality was that they were setting different targets all throughout the state for every different agency. So I think San Francisco was at 8, theoretically. We were at 16. Contra Costa was well into the 30s. And so, you had to achieve it or you're penalized. And so, while I think it was well-intentioned and to a degree, it was helpful for everybody every time they were driving on the freeway to see some sign that said, conserve, the drought is still happening, even though it was raining, later on in the drought. It might be helpful as a lesson for the future to return to allowing the agencies to work together to do the messaging.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the graph showing how statewide savings by region dropped at various times. And the most striking one was probably the best water press conference ever that the governor had, standing there with no snow, saying there's no snow. Everybody got it. I mean, I keep hearing about that all the time. Oh yeah, there was that. People remembered that. That was a moment. The regulations, not so much. There isn't any snow here, people, and there should be a lot of snow here. That drove it right home. And so, to me, that kind of big message is helpful. The more subtle stuff takes work. We have a very large communications group, so we're constantly working with our customers to try to make sure that they understand. We share that with our wholesale customers so they can take advantage of the same information and try to get consistent messaging out. We serve 26 wholesale customers, so we work with a lot of smaller groups to help make sure that they've got the tools as well to get a good message out there.
Yeah, I think that the partnership with the City of Livermore is a striking example of what can happen when you do have consistent messaging, and the type of support you can get from customers. And we receive support all over the state from the customers that we serve, but Livermore is a shining light in terms of the amount of reduction we were able to achieve, and I think it was in large part due to that. I would say that the messaging that we're talking about can't just happen during drought periods. It has to happen all the time. And the projects that we're talking about require and the investment that it's going to take to get these projects off the ground and in place. And it will require working with customers, having them understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what the importance of that is long-term, and what goes into the long-term planning to put that in place. And so my position would be, it can't, if you're just doing it during the drought, and you get a mandate from the state and the mandate's all over the place, it's impossible to have that unified message in a lot of cases. But if you're doing it on an ongoing basis and you have a relationship with your customers that you can build on in drought periods, I think that that's a big part of seeing a successful program.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.
And thank you, Lauren, for an awesome moderating job. So, as I promised, we have cookies and beverages outside waiting for more enlightening conversation. And so please stay if you can. And later today, you will get in your inbox an invitation to take a short survey giving us feedback on the event. Please help us out by filling it out, because it really helps us to improve our events for next time. And we hope that you'll join us next time for something here in San Francisco, and also we have events regularly in Sacramento. So thank you, and see you outside. Bye.